that have been taken. So it's a big year for India diplomatically as it assumes the G20 presidency. A lot of variables at play, from the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war, the ongoing border standoff between India and China, and of course, let's talk about all of this and more. I'm now joined by the U.S. Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, Victoria Nuland. Thank you very much for speaking with us here on CNN News 18.
Thank you, Zaka. Great to be with you.
Let's start with the biggest ongoing clash that is between Russia and Ukraine. What is the U.S. assessment of where the war stands right now as we pull up on a year since it began? And the million-dollar question everyone's asking, how is this likely to end?
Well, Zaka, as you have said, it is almost a year since Russia invaded Ukraine, and it has been very brutal and cruel, and not simply on the battlefield, but we also see Russia attacking civilian infrastructure throughout the winter. What they can't win on the battlefield, they're trying to win by freezing Ukrainians and cutting off the water, but Ukraine is standing strong and is fighting back hard. We and our allies and partners in the 50-some country coalition that supports Ukraine have understood that Russia could end this war any day if it stopped fighting. So if Russia stopped fighting, the war would end. If Ukraine stops fighting, Ukraine ends. And so, as you saw when the President and President Zelensky met in Washington in December, the Ukrainians are committed to continuing to try to fight for their land, and we are now trying to get them what they will need to launch a successful winter and spring offensive, because currently the map on the ground does not favor them.
So I'm curious to know, in this context, what the U.S. position is vis-a-vis India's stand. India's not necessarily always taken the position that Western countries have taken on this conflict, and in particular about the import of Russian oil. Russia, which was selling less than 1% of India's energy needs before this war began, and now it's India's largest energy supplier. I'm curious to know, have you had those conversations with your Indian counterparts?
So we've been having very rich conversations with India throughout this period, including before the war began, when we were worried about it. As you know better than I, India has historic dependencies that go back to the Soviet period, particularly in the security sphere. Almost all of India's weaponry comes from Russia and the Soviet Union. Now you see, not only is Russia not going to be in a position to resupply, but the weapons aren't working too well out there. So we've been having the conversation about diversifying away from that kind of dependency, doing more with the U.S. and with other friends in the defense sector. And of course, on the energy side, India, as you know, buys on the spot market, so it always goes for the best price. So one of the things that we've been talking about before and during and after the decision on an oil price cap by many of us was that this would actually benefit India. So even though you're buying more Russian oil, the fact that you're paying cheaper prices for it is good for India, but it also dries up the revenue that would otherwise contribute to Putin's war machine. So this is where we are now. You're going to buy your oil from somewhere. What we want to ensure is that you're not fueling the war.
I started off by saying that this is India's G20 year. It's a big
big year.
Year for India. You must have seen billboards and hoardings all around town talking about the G20. The last G20 in Bali was sort of overshadowed by this war. Do you reckon in 8 months' time, when India hosts the G20, we would have been seeing the end of this war, or will that still be the dominant theme, as it were?
Zaka, if I had a crystal ball, I would love for the Ukrainian people for this conflict to be over. But I think what's more important is that as host of the G20, India has a hugely strong role to play in the message that all of the big democracies are sending to the two big autocracies that are trying to change the rules of the road by force and coercion, whether it's Russia or whether it's China. So we've been doing a lot of talking together with India as you get ready to to host about the things that we need to work on together. We need to ensure resiliency in our supply chains. We need to ensure that China can't continue to indebt countries and not follow the global rules of the road there. I'm off to Sri Lanka after this. We talked about that, about our responsibilities for some of the challenges, whether it is in health. We've worked together on COVID. We're now working together on food security, which is obviously exacerbated by Russia's war on Ukraine. We have other work together to do to ensure resilient supply chains. Some of that work is being kicked off this week, in fact, by National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and National Security Advisor Doval. So a lot of things that we're doing together bilaterally are also enhanced by the fact that India is chairing the G20 this year.
I want to talk about the other autocracy, as you called it. There's been this ongoing standoff between India and China for the better part of the last 2 years. What is your best understanding of why China has tried to unilaterally change the status quo?
Well, obviously we oppose any unilateral efforts to, whether it's civilian, military, to change the status quo. I'm not going to speak for why China's doing what it is doing, but obviously it would be far better to try to settle these issues at the diplomatic table. In the past, India has had some success there, and I know that you are continuing to try, and we encourage that.
Just to take that conversation forward, the Indo-Pacific, of course, is a big priority for the United States, as indeed it is for India. Where do you see the future of Quad? We're already seeing countries like Japan, for example, which is a pacifist constitution, did not have an aggressive standing army. Now they're really thinking seriously about changing that posture. Do you see an increasing militarization of the Indo-Pacific?
Well, we're trying to do actually the opposite, Zaka. We're trying to ensure through the cooperation that we have, India, Australia, Japan, U.S., to preserve a free and open Indo-Pacific, not only in our own interest, but in global interest. 50% of global trade goes through the Taiwan Straits. So the work that we do in Quad is about keeping things open, keeping them free, but it's also about advancing maritime security. It's about advancing climate goals. It's advancing food security, all of these kinds of things that the democracies need to work on together, even as the autocracies work to change the global rules of the road.
You talked about Taiwan. There is increasing concern that there could be some kind of a military flare-up between China and Taiwan. We even had recently an American general say that in 2025 there's going to be a military action between China and Taiwan. What are the conversations you're having with the Chinese and with the Taiwanese to try and avoid that situation?
As you know, Zaka, President Biden sat down with President Xi Jinping last autumn in Bali to try to talk president to president about our responsibilities as big powers to maintain peace, to maintain stability, about the fact that, our One China policy and the Taiwan Relations Act together have kept the peace, have been a status quo situation that has helped us all avoid conflict for decades and decades and decades, and that if there is an effort to change that status quo now, and particularly by force, we're all going to suffer. So that's a conversation the presidents have had. We will now continue it in other channels with the Chinese. What we want is to ensure that we have crisis management release valves, that we can talk to each other as necessary, but we also want to reaffirm that the status quo has kept the peace, and to change that now is not good for China, it's not good for anybody, and it's certainly not good for global peace.
Last couple of questions. Let's talk a little bit about India's western neighbor, Pakistan. There is a massive economic crisis that's going on there. The IMF team, even as we speak, will be there for the next couple of weeks. What is your best assessment, again, of the financial situation there in that country, and what would the United States ideally like in terms of the India-Pakistan bilateral itself? Things have been far from normal for a while now.
Well, first and foremost, as you said, even before the massive floods, which put something like a third of Pakistani territory underwater. The financial balance wasn't good in Pakistan. So we have favored their intensive conversations with the IMF. As you know, the IMF is not a pushover, so there are some tough decisions that the Pakistanis need to make, but certainly it's in the interest of their people, recovery from the flood, the entire neighborhood, if the IMF can reach agreement with Pakistan. With regard to Pakistan and India, you know we have strong relations with both countries. From where we are sitting, whenever India and Pakistan can talk, it's a good thing, and we continue to encourage that.
All right, and one final word. Does the United States have any concerns on freedom of religious practices here in India, persecution of minorities? Could you give us a sense of what your conversations with your Indian counterparts are in that regard, if at all you have any concerns?
I would say, Zaka, that as democracies and as the world's biggest democracies, we all, both in America and in India, we have a responsibility to protect the values and the rights that come with that, including religious freedom for all. We struggle with that at home. And, you know, there are days when there are challenges for all of us. So we always have that conversation about how we can protect the democratic underpinnings that make us who we are and separate us from other kinds of governments where at least I would not want my children to grow up. And I'm going to guess the same is true for you.
All right. It indeed is. Thank you very much, Undersecretary Victoria Nuland, for speaking with us here on CNN News 18. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Zaka. Appreciate it.